Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Amy Barnes. I'm a senior advisor to the California China Climate Institute, and I'm really delighted to be here with you all today to discuss the book, China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet. The book takes a closer look at China's environmental actions through the lens of its governance system, arguing that the green agenda helps China achieve its state-led approach to geopolitical influence. Before we get started, a few quick housekeeping notes. Today's important discussion will last approximately 1.5 hours. If you would like to direct any questions to our speakers, please do enter them in the Q&A area on your screen at any time during the webinar, and I will do my best to make sure that our speakers answer them live. I wanted to start by making sure that we provide some context and a little bit of background on the impetus for this conversation and the sort of style of conversation that we have organized today that combines both the book discussion and musical experience, as you'll see later. And for that, I wanted to introduce Carl Mitchum, who, together with Jerry Brown, the head of our institute, has hosted these Ilitch-style events for a number of years and helped to inspire this event that you're all participating in today. So I'll start with a brief introduction to Carl and then pass over to him. Carl is a philosopher of engineering and technology and professor emeritus of humanities, arts, and social science at Colorado School of Mines, and visiting international professor of philosophy of technology at Renmin University of China. For some 50 years, he has been questioning the excessive dominance of technology in our lives, most recently in Steps Towards a Philosophy of Technology, which was published last year. He met Yvonne Ilitch and Governor Brown at about the same time in the mid-1980s, and says he learned quite a lot from both of them, and I'm sure the opposite is also true. So Carl, thank you so much for being here with us today, and really also for being the impetus to this conversation. It's been a pleasure and a delight getting to bring it to life with you, and would love to turn it over to you for some brief remarks.
Thank you, Amy. Our Zoom exchange today is a virtual homage to the work of Yvonne Ilitch, now celebrated in David Cayley's new 500-page intellectual biography. For more than 50 years, Ilitch wandered the world asking questions and calling attention to what he termed counterproductivity, the tendency of once beneficial institutions to expand beyond their benefit-producing capacities. In his introduction, Cayley describes how in midlife, having originally heard Ilitch only in lectures, he discovered a more convivial Ilitch in, quote, the middle of what he called a living room consultation, a small gathering in which food, drink, and friendship were the setting for intellectual interchange. Hosted in such consultations by many friends, including on more than one occasion by Jerry Brown, I suspect Yvonne would be scandalized at a Zoom attempt to imitate. Nevertheless, for those of us who knew him, it is hard not to want to honor Yvonne's legacy, even if only nominally, and without flesh, food, or drink. I'm personally grateful to Governor Brown and the California China Climate Institute for facilitating our ghostly global gathering for an intellectual interchange on the vision of a green China and its potential counterproductivities. So let me turn things over to Governor Brown.
Carl, thank you. Just a few thoughts. I'm not quite sure how you have a Ilitch-style conversation by Zoom, but probably better this than nothing at all. So that's the positive I see, a very good positive. For those of you who may not know, Yvonne Ilitch was a Catholic priest who went at a parish in Puerto Rican neighborhoods in New York, went to Puerto Rico itself, and was involved there in the university, and then left to go to Mexico and created a Center for Intercultural Documentation that brought people, scholars and priests and rebels and all sorts of people to talk in conversation about ideas about society, about the world. And he ceased his priestly ministry because he wanted to be more independent, didn't want to speak as a theologian, but more as a human being. His insights are provocative. They open up vistas, possibilities that many people never before imagined. And I can say that as a person who's been in the practical realm, governor of California 16 years, mayor of Oakland 8 years, head of the Democratic Party, candidate for president, some of Illich's ideas, like unplugging, like gainful unemployment, these are counter establishment ideas that are provocative and are good mind experiments and have to be understood and taken up in I think a proper spirit of inquiry. I think that really is the spirit of Yvonne Ilitch: open inquiry and seeing connections. Conviviality, friendship is at the heart of all this, at the heart of his view of the world. So it wasn't often the academic success. He wasn't he wasn't a tenured professor, wasn't on the tenure track. He was an itinerant intellectual, teaching by example and seminars, but he was all over the world, and many contradictions if you look at this biography. So he is definitely a counter force, a type of intellectual anarchist, but a believing Christian, although not an institutional one, a Catholic, but not a hierarchical Catholic. But so very interesting, someone who looked to the 12th century for inspiration and challenged so many of our institutions. So I think it is a very bracing set of ideas that you can gather from Yvonne Ilitch. Certainly I've taken from that, and also the friendships that come around. And he certainly emphasized the idea of the table, friendships, disciplined study, a candle on the table to shine the light of human vitality and exchange, a good bowl of spaghetti, bottle of wine, and then the kind of conversation that flows in that way. So we're not doing that, but that same openness, but disciplined inquiry, that we can capture. So we're looking at, I would want to add one more point. Like some other thinkers that I've known, Yvonne Ilitch had a view of the world that I think you could call apocalyptic. And that's a world, by the way, that is somewhat congenial to me. Not congenial, but it's familiar. I'm the executive chairman of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and we put out the doomsday clock, which is a metaphor, but based on scientific discussion and analysis and a conclusion of how close we are to some apocalyptic event, like a nuclear war, a nuclear blunder, climate destruction, some other kind of disruptive technology like the virus running out of control. So the doomsday clock at one time was 17 minutes before midnight for doomsday. It's now 100 seconds. We stopped counting in minutes, we've gone to seconds. So, and that perspective, although it's not maybe what Yvonne Ilitch would have done or been a part of, he still said, looking to the future, I'd have to say he had an ominous sense of what humankind could do. And I want to say I share that concern that all this brain power and technology has created such power, but wisdom and restraint and humanity and empathy have not been in evidence in the same proportion. So that's the dilemma we find ourselves with ever more powerful technology, with the same national antagonisms, the same deeply divergent beliefs. And here we are on this planet of 7.9 billion people. So climate is certainly one of the key topics. And as we try to solve that, we realize that carbon emissions in the various forms of CO2, methane, chlorofluorocarbons, soot, and things like that, they come from all over the planet. And so every part of planet Earth has to be part. Every part of humanity has to be part of the solution. But when we say we mean America, the America of Trump, the America of Biden, the China of Xi, the Russia of Putin, the England, EU, Africa, India of Modi. We got a real divergent world. And people invoke this word diversity as a total positive, but I see this diversity of beliefs as a challenge. And if we can't rise to a higher level of identity and understanding, then we may well get to midnight, to catastrophe of unimaginable consequences. So that's my thought. And as we look to China, we can say China bad, China good, but also we can say the same thing, but very differently about the United States. And in my own background, Catholic background, I would say I'm much more of a skeptical and free thinker at this moment in my life. But this sense that we have to be humble, more humility in the face of complexity and the diversity of the world. And yet we don't see humility in our national leaders. And they're all, it brings me, I think of the poem of Matthew Arnold. Here we are as on a darkling plain where ignorant armies clash by night. So maybe they're not ignorant, maybe they're intelligent armies, but we're clashing. And it is night in the sense that we don't have the illumination of shared facts, shared insight, and deep wisdom. So with that, I look forward to hearing others give their thoughts on this very interesting book about China, what they're doing and what they're not doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Governor Brown, for that introduction and for, as always, sharing your wisdom. And as you said, while we can't have a in-person table, we'll have to take this virtual table and take some of the illumination that you and Carl have provided by your introductions as a way of shining a light on the conversation that we'll have now between Dr. Judith Shapiro and Dr. Yifei Li. And I think we've teed up a tall order for you in your conversation. Open and disciplined inquiry, conviviality, and friendship. But from my review and understanding of your work and your collaboration together, I think you're up to the task. So with that, I will turn to introducing Dr. Shapiro and Dr. Li. And just to give a little bit of a read ahead for the rest of the evening, after their reflections, we will enjoy a musical interlude from Climate Music, followed by another reflection and response. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll have plenty of time for audience questions. So please do not hesitate to include your questions in the Q&A panel. I'm now delighted and really grateful to Dr. Judith Shapiro and Dr. Yifei Li for spending this time with us. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Shapiro first. Dr. Shapiro is the director of the Masters in Natural Resources and Sustainable Development for the School of International Service at American University and chair of the Global Environmental Politics Program. She was one of the first Americans to live in China after US-China relations were normalized in 1979 and taught English at the Hunan Teachers College in Changsha, China. Dr. Shapiro's research and teaching focuses on global environmental politics and policy, the environmental politics of Asia, and Chinese politics under Mao. She is the author, a co-author or editor of 9 books. And then I'll also introduce Dr. Li. Dr. Yifei Li is Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU Shanghai and Global Network Assistant Professor at NYU. In the 2020-2021 academic year, he's also a residential fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich. His research concerns both the macro level implications of Chinese environmental governance for state-society relations, marginalized populations, and global ecological sustainability, as well as the micro level bureaucratic processes of China's state interventions into the environmental realm. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Shapiro and Dr. Li, and I'll turn it over to you now for your remarks.
Thank you so much, Aimee, for the very generous introduction. And thank you, Dr. Brown, for giving us such an excellent opening remarks. It's just great to be able to follow your remarks by saying that we want to give our presentation in the spirit of having open and disciplined inquiries into the state of the world. In the case of this book, Judy and I are greatly honored to be able to share our work with all of you. And the presentation today, as the previous speakers have mentioned, is based on our book that's titled China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet. Before we go into the substance of our book, we wanted to just tell you a little bit about ourselves. Over to Judy.
I am muted. I wanted to thank Carl particularly for bringing us here, and for Governor Brown for welcoming us, and for everyone who's put this together. It's been a long time in the making. And I always believe that when you're listening to a speaker, it's a good idea to know sort of where they're coming from. So my hope is that if I turn myself like this, you'll realize who I am. So this is to establish my bona fides, my credentials, as it were. I've been involved with China since 1977, back and forth to China ever since then. And here I'm trying to blend in a little more. I always say I was lucky when I was young. I was short and my hair was dark. Over to Yifei.
And that's me, a native of Shanghai. The picture on the right-hand side shows the building in which I grew up, which is at the intersection of Nanjing Road and Henan Road. For those of you who know the geography of Shanghai, it's right at the heart of the city, about 2 blocks to the much storied Bund.
Mm-hmm. So we wanted to talk, go ahead, Yifei.
Sorry, yeah. So we wanted to tell you a little bit about the impetus for writing this book. I'll go with the first, and Judy can say a little more about the second impetus. One of the things that the two of us were beginning to realize a lot more as we talked to each other on the sides of conferences, and because we oftentimes found ourselves at the exact same panel of conferences that the two of us go to. And we were taking note of a growing interest in the scholarly literature as well as in the popular literature on this notion of authoritarian environmentalism. The idea that democracies have not been terribly effective in producing responses to the climate challenge in particular and environmental challenges in general, such that many observers, especially in the West and in the English-speaking parts of the West, were speculating the possibility of using authoritarian means to accomplish environmental ends. So there have been a lot of discussions on that note, and we were concerned that that discussion perhaps was a little too speculative. There's not enough on the ground empirical evidence to actually examine the promises and risks of using authoritarian approaches for environmental ends. And we wanted to write this book together to be able to provide that kind of grounded analysis. Over to Judy.
Yeah, so the second impetus was that for the last several decades, we've been hearing a lot about something called ecological migration. The Chinese state, from way back to imperial times, has been struggling to pacify the borderlands. And it seems that now with the green agenda, they've got a brand new excuse to force nomads away from their traditional livelihoods and into more civilized towns and villages. So this was something that, as an environmentalist, the Chinese say it hurts their feelings. It hurt my feelings as an environmentalist to find that environmental reasons were being given for essentially cultural destruction. So I wanted to explore that quite a bit more. And many Chinese scholars have also been very critical of this ecological migration agenda. Next
and in
slide.
that context, we wanted to focus our attention on this notion of ecological civilization. And there seems to be the tendency on the part of many scholars and observers to just dismiss this notion of ecological civilization as yet another propagandist's invention coming out of China. Or that may well be true in some senses. But at the same time, we want to emphasize that this notion of ecological civilization carries a lot of ideological and political baggages in China, such that we aren't so ready to just dismiss the notion out of hand. We think ecological civilization as a political strategy is important for us to actually understand, because this notion, by virtue of it being enshrined in the Chinese Constitution and the Constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, seem to suggest a rather long-term commitment on the part of the Chinese party state, in the sense that the Chinese party state is describing in its official historiography of the Chinese nation as having a very long civilizational history of about 2,000 years. And much of that history, prior to the late 19th century, were a history of glorious human developments. And the Chinese Communist Party sees itself as a political apparatus that is capable of reviving China and restoring China back to that former civilizational glory. And looking into the future, they're saying that it's not just any kind of renewed civilizational leadership, but an ecological kind of civilizational leadership that has never been attempted before in human history. So in that sense, the party ideology work and the party political institutions are structured in such a way as to produce this kind of novel leadership. And as such, environmental protection as an area of policy making carries unique significance for the Chinese Communist Party. So we need to understand some of the implications for that kind of high-level endorsement.
So I'm going to give you a very, very fast overview. This is the table of contents of the book. Don't worry, we're not going to give you examples of all of these, but essentially the book follows a spatial logic from the developed eastern part of the country to the less developed borderlands, to the state on the green belt and road, and then to the state even into outer space. And for each of these spatial locations, we tried to identify tools that the state tends to use in order to achieve its nominally green goals. And we found many positive examples and many negative examples. The book is pretty balanced, I believe. But one of the risks that we found is with these campaigns and crackdowns or target setting or behavior modification just from the eastern part, that often innocent people or innocent factories or people are caught up in the net of this kind of very quantitative, technocratic, top-down, scientistic sort of approach. And that what we want to say in the book is that there are risks involved in that, because if the ordinary people are not enlisted and they don't support these campaigns and they don't support these environmental moves, then they're not going to succeed in the long run. So we're going to give you a couple of examples of each of these. This one is mine too, I think. Okay, this is campaigns. You know, sometimes when there's a high-level meeting in Beijing or Shanghai or wherever, they'll have a sort of blue skies campaign. So, of course, there was a 2008 Olympics blue, and then there was the APEC blue, and the parade blue to celebrate the big Communist Party anniversary, G20 blue. And this is just a leftover decoration, but I love this image because it actually serves to remind the ordinary Chinese people that their sky is not blue. And sometimes they feel like, what, we're less important than these high-level leaders. So when the high-level leaders come, you know, the factories are shut down, ordinary people can't get to work, they're not allowed to drive, the skies are momentarily blue and then they're gray again.
Another example of the campaign-style environmental governance is the new recycling mandate that came into effect in July of 2019. This new recycling initiative in the city of Shanghai turns out to be highly restrictive in the sense that they only allow citizens to dispose of their garbage during a 2-hour window in the morning and a 2-hour window in the evening. If you just can't make it back home in time to dispose of your trash, you simply will be illegally dumping your trash in the city. And as you see, many people can't make it back home in time, and they ended up having to throw their garbage away outside of the trash can. And in addition, the city has imposed such a strict and if you will, a meticulously designed system for color-coded classification of different types of garbage, such that they really want the citizens to be able to follow these rules. And they have hired these quote-unquote garbage inspectors to be on the side of these garbage collection centers during the 4-hour windows every day to inspect the kind of garbage that people were disposing of on a daily basis. And this is a picture of one of those garbage inspectors taking a video of a citizen who was disposing of garbage. One of the things that we should really take note of is that this new recycling campaign in the city of Shanghai doesn't suggest that there was no recycling behavior or no recycling industry before the introduction of the government-mandated formalized recycling initiative. Prior to July of 2019, there have been a very robust recycling industry in the city, except that the previous industry wasn't controlled by the government, it wasn't formalized, it wasn't institutionalized. These individual households, mom and pop operations on tricycles, on these flatbed tricycles, collect all sorts of recyclables from various people in the city. And that system had worked very well up until the introduction of the new policy, which turns out to restrict the kind of behaviors on the citizens, to invade into privacy whenever people go to the garbage collection center, and they have the side effect of pushing these mom and pop recyclers out of existence in this very city.
This slide we wanted to share with you to give you a sense of what it's like to be a low-level official in China. So it gives you a taste of some of the quantitative target setting policies that low-level officials are forced to try to meet. And you can imagine that, I mean, this is so specific. Forest cover rate, 23.04%. And so what happens then is a low-level official, in their eagerness to comply, because of course their promotions and their salary raises and even the longevity of their position is going to depend on their ability to meet these targets, they sometimes over compensate or they over comply, with the result that a couple winters ago, there wasn't enough natural gas when they had to shut down all the coal at the national directive. And a couple summers ago also in Henan province, whenever the threshing machines were turned on, air pollution went really high. And so the local officials told the local farmers that they couldn't use their threshing machines, and as a result, all the grain went to waste. So just a taste of this kind of mentality.
So the previous examples were primarily about what happens in terms of environmental governance in the industrial eastern parts of the country. And now we would like to shift our attention to the western borderlands of the country. And we wanted to give you an example of ecological restoration or ecological rehabilitation in what's known as the Loess Plateau in the west of the country. And in the 1990s, for those of you who follow Chinese environmental governance, you might know that the early 1990s was a period when the World Bank, in collaboration with various levels of the Chinese government, invested significantly into the rehabilitation of the Loess Plateau. One of the things that's really significant about that rehabilitation effort was that the World Bank sent teams and teams of experts into China, into the Loess Plateau area for 2 years without actually doing any intervention work on the ground. For 2 years, they sent ecologists, economists, political scientists, sociologists, and all sorts of experts to engage in a fact-finding mission to understand the local livelihoods conditions, local people's memory of what worked in terms of what they did to the forests and what they did to the grasslands and so on and so forth. After this 2-year fact-finding mission, they put together a comprehensive rehabilitation plan that made ecological sense, that provided livelihood support for the people, that made economic sense for the region, and overall it was a huge success. But after the initial phase of the project, in the haze to scale up, quote unquote, the success story, the Chinese government decided to replicate only a part of that rehabilitation plan, which was to plant trees, and to plant a lot of trees, and oftentimes the same kind of trees. This attempt to make monocultural forests may have the immediate effect of showing, quote unquote, ecological success. But over time, because they have the tendency to plant a lot of poplar trees, as some of you may know, which have very, very deep root systems, they in fact have the long-term ecological tendency of sucking up so much underground water to intensify desertification and to worsen ecological damage. In other words, what we want to suggest through this case is that the initial success of the Loess Plateau Rehabilitation Program was because of the state's openness to a wide range of inputs and a committed understanding of the long-term ecological and social processes that were at play. Whereas when they wanted to hasten the process of environmental intervention without listening to the scientists and the people, they have the tendency to follow programs that were ill-informed, and in the end, even well-intended programs can easily go awry.
Yeah, so the Belt and Road. Yeah, so I'm sure most of you know this, right? But so originally this is a revival of the old Silk Route, plus the Sea Route that goes around South Asia. But now we got everything, you know, we got a polar Belt and Road, we got an outer space Belt and Road, there's a dairy Belt and Road that goes from New Zealand to China. The Belt and Road extends to Djibouti and into Latin America. So the Belt and Road is pretty much, you know, everything that China is doing overseas. And I think that's enough of that. So been thinking a long time now about the environmental implications of China's rise, whether along the Belt and Road or just in general. And here's just 3 examples. I'll try to be quick. The consumption of wildlife for traditional Chinese medicine, right? So it affects all these endangered species. And of course, it facilitates the jumping of zoonotic diseases from wildlife to people. So we saw what happened with that, right? The Chinese have always wanted to consume this wildlife, but until they were wealthy, they couldn't afford it, right? So now there's tremendous pressure on all of these species. And there's actually a success story to be told here, or we're an incipient success story. And we'll get to a slide about that in a little bit. Oh, here's the slide about that. Okay, let's go to the slide about that. Who's that? That's Yao Ming, the basketball player with an adorable little friend. So, the people have gotten involved in these efforts to curb the consumption of shark fin and also the consumption of ivory. So everywhere you go in Beijing and the subways, it's all ivory belongs to elephants. And Yongmou has lent his reputation to this campaign. And so although cutting the use of ivory is going to be harder than reducing the use of shark fin, which is already very, very successful. Because ivory is a really entrenched kind of value for its aesthetic properties, but still this is potentially a very good success, a really good example of how the government, with ordinary people, with civil society groups, with international law like CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, can come together to deal with like a global crisis. So maybe we can go back. Oh, well, we can go for, I don't know, I'm not watching the time. So just two more, generally speaking, China's running out of its own raw materials. And, if you do sort of capitalism theory, capitalism always needs more raw materials and it also always needs more markets. And so in a way, the rise of China and the going out of China with the extraction of all of these raw materials is, it has all kinds of negative implications for landscapes and for livelihoods. And finally, the Belt and Road is really built around infrastructure, ports, dams, pipelines, roads and railroad power plants. And there's a lot of attention to climate change. Okay, climate change is the big event of our world, but there's a neglect sometimes of the impact of biodiversity, of the fragmentation of these landscapes by these pipelines, et cetera. So that's a big issue as well.
And on the Belt and Road, we see a lot of these initiatives that are already unfolding, even though the coronavirus pandemic has set back some of those projects. But one of the things I think constitutes some sort of a consistent theme across our investigation, from China's industrial east to its western borderlands, and then to the Belt and Road Initiative, and even into China's interventions into the global commons, is that many of the environmental interventions on the part of the Chinese state, and perhaps this is also true for environmental interventions in general, is that they don't just have environmental consequences. They oftentimes have spillover effects into other realms. They have spillover effects into how social management is conducted in the country. They have spillover effects into how ethnic minorities are being integrated or homogenized into the mainstream majority culture of Han ethnicity in China. They have also geopolitical spillover effects into how China collaborates or partners with its friends or allies on the Belt and Road. In general, we just think it's very important for us to be attentive to these non-environmental effects of environmental policies in general. And on to the global commons, Judy.
Yeah, okay, so so many of you are experts here in technocracy and the risks of technology. The Chinese state is in love with technology. And so one of the things that they're doing, the state is very worried about glacier melt on the Tibetan Plateau. In the short term, it causes a lot of flooding, but in the longer term, it causes drought, aquifer depletion, and so on. So there's actually a project to shoot silver iodide on a regular basis whenever the monsoons come up from India, shoot silver iodide into the clouds and basically seed the clouds, create ice crystals, and make it rain, which is what we saw earlier with the Blue Skies campaigns, right? But what's different about this is they're actually modifying the weather on the Tibetan Plateau. It's an ongoing project where at least tens of thousands of these silver iodide shooting machines are being installed. And this is a project conceived by, Beijing Normal University and Tsinghua University. And, the scientists and the engineers are running the place for better or worse, right? But they're failing to deal with the people, right? We've lost the people. And we don't know sometimes when we wield this kind of technology, what the long-term consequences may be.
So we wanted to, this is our concluding slide. We wanted to go back to the thesis with which we started, which is the hypothesis of authoritarian environmentalism. In other words, using authoritarian means to accomplish environmental ends, which, as you would remember, was the prevailing sentiment of what China could potentially exemplify. Our investigation, on the other hand, suggests a model in which environmental protection is being used as a means for the Chinese state to accomplish its authoritarian agenda at home and overseas. In other words, instead of practicing what many people seem to think is authoritarian environmentalism, what we're finding is precisely the opposite, is environmental authoritarianism on the part of the Chinese state. Judy has another concluding remark to make.
I do? I don't know what it is.
Oh.
Yifei did a great job. That's I know our other concluding remark. I've already made the point. You got to have the people behind you. You know, you've got to invest it. If they'd explained in Shanghai about the recycling policy and the people had been able to spearhead the recycling policy, then maybe, you know, it would have been perceived as a good thing rather than another intervention by the state into individual liberty. But instead, the state just did a heavy-handed, no announcement, boom, here it is, and actually start to figure it into your social credit score and put it in your irises and all of that. So it gets a little scary. So yeah, so what we find is that in the long run, when the state can go back to trusting the people, in a way, go back to their roots, the Communist Party's roots of supervision by the masses, consultation, public participation, all of those things that the Yan'an years were known for, they would do a lot better and they would be able to achieve their environmental goals in a much less heavy-handed fashion.
Indeed. So thank you, everybody, for your attention. You know, in conclusion, there's much to admire, but also a lot to be careful about moving forward. Thanks again. I now turn it over back to Aimee.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful overview of the book. And for those who have not had a chance to check it out, I think hopefully an encouragement to pick it up and read the whole piece. We're delighted now to open our first discussion of the evening, and this will be framed on reflecting on China at home, building on the great discussion that we just had. And as the name suggests, we'll focus specifically on what China is doing within the country at home. And we have two wonderful discussants that will each have about 5 to 8 minutes to provide comments and deliver their perspectives. And then we'll integrate questions from the audience. And there are some questions already coming in. So I will introduce the our two discussants now and then open the discussion. First, we'll hear from Dr. Ren Ren. Dr. Ren is the Associate Professor, School of International Relations at Renmin University in China. And Dr. Ren's research focuses on environmental politics, comparative politics, public policy analysis, and decentralization in local governments. And then we'll hear from Dr. Yongmou, who is a professor in the School of Philosophy at Renmin University. He's the Chief Director of the Division Committee Youth Researchers and the Society for Natural Dialectics of China, and the Director of the Society for Natural Dialectics of Beijing. His work focuses on philosophy of science and technology, issues in science, technology, and society, and science, technology, and public policy. And he has published 12 books and over 60 papers. So Dr. Ren, I will turn it to you first to open up the discussion. Please take it away.
Thank you, Aimee, for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this webinar on China's green politics and the policy. It's a great pleasure to discuss Professor Li and Professor Shapiro's thought-provoking new book, China Goes Green. To my knowledge, I believe this is the first book in English to systematically examine the non-environmental consequences of environmental authoritarianism, use the author's word. which really deconstruct the green image of China to a certain degree. I found my previous research on China's environmental politics actually resonates with some of the observations and thoughts in this book. My own research in the past decades mainly focused on understanding the big gap between the central government's glorious-looking environmental policy and the rhetoric and the environmental outcomes of local implementation from the perspective of incentive structures, governing structure, blame avoidance game between central and local officials, and also public legitimacy construction. So one of my key findings in my own research is that the big gap between the lofty green political rhetoric as what Yifei and Judy said, the 生态文明, the ecological civilization, and the reality is often explained by a phrase from a Yuan dynasty in China, that is, the heaven is high and the emperor is far away. So within China, people generally trust the central government great will to fight pollution and the global warming, but they are not they are dissatisfied with the efficiency of local government. So this is actually a reverse pattern of the United States. As the establishment of this California-China Climate Institute. So when the Trump said climate change is a Chinese hoax, and the withdrawal U.S. from the Paris Agreement. So California is actually on the contrary, working together with China to support further the climate action through joint research, training, and dialogue. So, so the state level actually doing much better than the federal level, but this is exactly the opposite opinion in China. So I call this is the blame local government discourse in my own research. So this discourse see the major obstacle to China's climate governance as the local governments and officials who turn a blind eye to the polluters in their own jurisdictions. They ignore the good policies from higher up. So from this point of view, the reason Beijing's green policies are ineffective is because local officials, they oppose these central government policies or refuse to implement them properly. Well, most of my own research try to deconstruct this blaming local government discourse in China. I also found it is quite difficult to empirically identify the differences between the intentional and the unintentional outcome of China's state-led environmentalism. So I wonder whether this difficulty might also apply to Professor Shapiro and Professor Li's new book. So for instance, the core argument in this book is that instead of a means to achieve the end of sustainability, environmentalism in China is actually a means to strengthen the party-state authoritarian resilience. I agree with some of the authors' observations, but I think the question remains that, so this is an intended outcome or it is an intended outcome. So how we can test this? So China's state is actually very fragmented in a way that different agencies have their own agenda and bureaucratic interests. So therefore, the question need to be further answered is, within this China's fragmented environmental state, who or which particular agency is using this environmentalism as the clothing of authoritarianism? So in other words, how to empirically test the genius of commitment agreement to environmental value. So what are the criteria of defining this, the true go to green? So for example, we can ask ourselves, so which country is a model of truly goes to green? So maybe some European countries in our mind. So I think these questions are actually related to the different types of environmental philosophy. Often they fight with each other. In the point of view of deep ecology philosophy, ecology per se should have its own moral and legal rights, independent of its instrumental benefits for human use. But the supporters of sustainable development and liberal environmentalism are actually always using the environment as the tool to fulfill their non-environmental purpose, such as economic growth, prosperity, human rights, and etc. So my understanding is that even with the ideology of ecological civilization, Chinese government do not officially support the value of deep ecology. So therefore, they don't actually believe green per se has its own meaning and end. But China is not unique in this side. So I don't think any current government or ruling party in this world actually hold a deep ecology philosophy, maybe except some green parties in Europe. This actually raised another question is, so why Chinese leadership purposely selects the green as the closing of this authoritarianism? Because it could be a double-edged sword for the party state to maintain its legitimacy, right? It could be like, as the author said, it could be lifting a stone only to drop it on its own feet. So maybe we can discuss this more later. But so that my last question is, like, if like China is using this as a tool or closing for this authoritarianism, so why the Western liberal world still want to cooperate with China, and how can do that if China is not just really interested into this green value? And this green value is only to maximize China's power in international community. So how do we build this trust? When Trump said climate change is a Chinese hoax, like maybe a lot of people in liberal world think the China is also using this as a tool to maintain their authoritarianism. So I'll just stop here, and thank you very much for the wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rand. There's so much in there to unpack, and I just wanted to draw out one of the points you made, that few or no global governments have a deep ecology philosophy. I think that's a point that Jerry Brown has made many times that I've heard. So I think you would be in agreement there. And now would like to turn it over to Professor Liu Yongmou. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay. Dear colleagues, great thanks for Professor Judith Shapiro to invite me to join her symposium on her and Yifei's new book, China Goes Green. Also, great thanks for Professor Carl Mitchell introducing me to Judith. Since my time is limited, I'd like to just mention one idea about this book after I read this book. The title of my short talk says the reflection of environmental issues can be more technical and less ideological. As the book mentions, China emphasized economic development in the early of the reform and opening up period, not paying enough attention to the environmental protection. I knew this firsthand. In the early 90s, I studied environmental engineering as an undergraduate, and then found it was very difficult to find a job because China environmental industry just began in that time. And entering the 21st century, the China advocates sustainable development and ecological civilization, paying close attention to environmental issues, especially since the 18th National Congress of the CPC. The government has invested a lot of people, money, and the resources to improve the environment with obvious results. I live in Beijing, and in a few years, the situation of frequent smog in Beijing, this, has been completely changed. This amazes even the people in Beijing, let alone the foreigners. But in past, the Chinese environmental protection has been weak, and some foreigners have criticized China for sacrificing the environment for the economy. And the Chinese people's right to health has been threatened. And now, the environmental protection is strong in China, but some foreigners are criticizing China for authoritarian governance to environmental issues. And the Chinese people's freedom is under threat. You can't see the criticism are completely unjustified, because no one could do a work 100% perfect. But the obvious question is protecting the environment or not protecting the environment. China always confronts the severe ideological denouncement. What should China do first? In the issue of environment, China cannot copy USA, since it's well known, it's how American democracy to take the centralized action to protect the environment. Which often unnecessary methods to protect environment, and the Trump government withdrawing from the environmental treaties reflects a lot of American public do not support the environmental policy of the Obama administration. They think such policies sacrifice the working position. So should we still protect the environment? What is the real problem? Obviously, some scholars who reconsider on the environmental issues have some problems in their basic position. They are inflexible in willing to a set of outdated ideas, I think, that do not account for reality, that allow with the practical environmental issues. In China, such a stereotype was titled Baizuo, means the white of left. For example, why can the democracy cope with environmental problems? Someone attributes this to mindset. The democracy cannot use central coercive measures. Who says democracy is nothing but endless and fruitless chorus? I don't think so. Today's American democracy based on the extreme individualism, a long anti-intellectual tradition, and liberalism, and is really not suited to deal with environmental problems. Environmental issues involve a wide range of areas and involve the interests of various groups. Technically speaking, they certainly need to be dealt with in a centralized and the integrated manner. However, can the democracy only be the kind of American democracy we have today? For example, the German democracy with more emphasis on discipline, Japanese democracy with more emphasis on the collective interests, are same democracies with American democracy. The social democracy in China is totally different from America. Theoretically, the democracy needs not to bind with extreme individualism, anti-intellectualism, and liberalism. I think there are some effective social engineering tools that democracies can use in some extent. For example, of course, democracy also needs rein in these technocratic measures to prevent experts from being too powerful and threatening the bedrock of the democracy. All the instruments of efficiency cannot be dismissed simply as authoritarianism or totalitarianism. Instead, they should be studied in detail and selected, adjusted, and controlled based on understanding that they can serve democracy. So the same is true of the environment issues. Simply generalizing the Chinese environmental policy into authoritarianism, environmentalism, and then defend it and draw a conclusion that the environment threats force the world running into the authoritarianism, or totally criticize it and draw a conclusion that China is seizing the opportunity to practice the authoritarianism in the name of protecting the environment. Such ideological debates fall into dichotomy mindset and do not reflect the true state of Chinese environment issues. Yeah, more importantly, in the ideological debate, the planet continues to deteriorate, like in the COVID-19 epidemic. How many lives could have been saved if we had not been obsessed with ideological arguments? In the past few years, I focused on a theory of 艺术治理, means technical governance. So-called technical governance is the governance activity that use achievements of modern science and technology in the running society. In English, such discussions are largely in the name of technocracy. However, I think the term technocracy has rather pejorative connotation. So I use the new term technical governance, which includes the technocracy as one kind of it, and which we consider technical phenomena with more objective and neutral attitude. Why? After entering the 21st century, technical governance has become a global basic trend. The COVID-19 greatly promotes it. Whatever ideas and stance you have, but no one could deny that the technical governance plays a vital role in dealing with COVID-19. I even argue that the contemporary society is a society of technical governance. In such conditions, if we simply refuse the technical governance and do not deep research it, the technical governance would become the elephant in the room. Many Western thinkers had always equated the technocracy with I called a machine utopia, namely that its goal is to turn society into a large machine and each individual into a replaceable part of the machine. But this is a wrong impression. There is not only one model of technocratic governance, either from the historic movement or from the theoretic analysis. As a matter of fact, the American technocracy movement introduced into China as soon as it arose, and the attempt of technocracy in the Republic of China was very different from that in the United States. Therefore, the technical governance does not equate to the machine utopia and does not necessarily equate to the totalitarianism. Democracy can use the technical governance to serve itself, to keep it in modest degree. Recently, I'm working on a book called Theory of Technical Governance, which is proposing a whole new set of theories to try to understand, adjust, and control the contemporary technical governance. So as far as the environmental protection, any country needs to adopt some efficient social engineering measures if it wants to achieve effective governance, which cannot simply be dismissed as authoritarianism. Such ideological accusations are not conducive to in-depth research, and in particularly hinder the democracy effort to use the technical governance to deal with the environmental issue. Sure, sir, I do not mean that social engineering measures can be implemented without problems, such as it's not to being as efficient as expected, such as it may overstep its power bounds, such as some groups' lives are influenced. However, we cannot totally deny the importance of the efficiency measures in solving environmental issues. To sum up, I mean, to dealing with the environmental issues is essentially a matter of coordination between groups. But too much ideology and too little technical discussion is not conducive to environment governance and ecological improvements. I think it's important to remember that why we talk about such ideological arguments, we want to make a better theoretical defense for protecting the environment. So what is more important than the ideological arguments is that we must resolve to do something to protect the environment. So in a new book, my new book, Epidemic Response and Technology Governance, to publish in this year, I propose the idea of technological humility on environmental issues, which I think, firstly, we need to evaluate the power of technology objectively. Second, totally transform from the conquering nature to revealing nature. And third, oppose the modalism and advocate the pluralism of view of nature. The fourth, change from the protecting the environment to ensuring the continuation of the race. Actually, you know, I do not agree with the environment, the term environmental protection. In my opinion, human beings cannot protect the environment. The environment does not need a human protection. If the earth is covered with plastic bags, it will be human, not lives, that will die out. So the COVID-19 makes it clear that humans are simply not powerful enough to defend themselves against the novel virus. Yeah. Okay. That's what I like to say. Thank you. Thanks, Professor Judith Shapiro.
Wonderful. Thank you all for those remarks. I know we're running a little bit behind time, so I'm going to move us now to the musical interlude. Please do continue to drop your questions into the Q&A. I know some of the panelists have been very generous in answering those directly there. And then we'll also, once the musical section is done, we'll come back and have our closing conversation that focuses on China and the world. So with that, I would like to turn to a musical interlude from Climate Music. I'm really delighted to have them there, and there's a personal and a China tie with the Climate Music Initiative. So the Climate Music Project is a nonprofit, nonpartisan collaboration of scientists and world-class musicians that create musical and visual experiences guided by the scientific data on climate change. And their mission is to communicate a sense of urgency about the climate crisis by combining science with the emotional power of music to drive meaningful action. And I first became aware of climate music through Fran Schulberg, who was the former head of the China-US Energy Efficiency Alliance, and one of the early people advising and partnering with me and former Governor Brown following his trip to China in 2013 as governor. So we are so delighted to have Richard Festinger here, the composer of Icarus in Flight. Richard, thank you for joining us. And he will now introduce this musical experience. Composer Festinger is a professor emeritus of San Francisco State University and has international recognition for his extensive catalog of vocal and instrumental compositions. He's the recipient of numerous major awards and commissions and has been honored with both the Walter Henriksen Award and an Academy Recording Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So Composer Festinger, thank you again for being here with us, and over to you to introduce the composition.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you for the very nice introduction. I'm so pleased to be a part of today's panel. It's so unusual for the arts to be able to participate so directly in this kind of discussion, and I hope it happens much more frequently. In modeling the Earth's changing climate, my string quartet, Icarus in Flight, uses historical data on population growth, carbon emissions, and land use transformation during the period from 1880 projected out to 2080 to control certain aspects of the music. Population growth controls the average density of musical events over time, increasing in the worst case by a factor of 9. In this context, density means the number of musical events in a given amount of time. Carbon emissions control the frequency range of the music from lowest to highest pitch, increasing gradually from a perfect fifth in the middle register to a span of 6 1/4 octaves at its peak magnitude. With respect to land use, an increase from 13 to 43% of the Earth's non-ice covered land surface devoted to human use is represented by the increasing proportion of music that is played with specialized timbres or tone colors, such as pizzicato, rapid tremolo bowing, and bowing close to the bridge. Icarus in Flight is comprised of 3 large sections played without pause, the first representing the years 1880 to 1945, when data are growing slowly. The second from 1945 to 2015, when growth accelerates exponentially. And the third part from 2015 to 2080. The excerpt you're about to hear begins in the year 2034, our future, and the data projections alternate between the best and worst case future scenarios. The scenario where we do everything possible to mitigate climate change, and the scenario where we do nothing. These 2 scenarios are based on models developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a scientific body under the auspices of the United Nations. The large clock face in the video indicates the year. The left side of the screen tracks the statistics for each data set, and the right hand shows blue for the best case scenario and red for the worst case. Each year occupies about 8 seconds of musical time. Icarus in Flight was commissioned by the Climate Music Project. For fuller information on their climate advocacy work, please visit climatemusic.org. And please, Amy, let's play the video now. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing that with us. And wow, just beautiful and haunting. And I agree that we don't have enough opportunities for the interaction between science and political science and dialogues like these and music and the arts. So thank you for sharing. And I hope this can be the first of many opportunities for us to do this again. Thank you so much for sharing that music with us and for your work. We now are going to turn and take the last 10 minutes of our time together for an open discussion and exchange on China and the world. And I really want to invite both everyone, all of our panelists, and everyone who is participating to share questions in the Q&A. And maybe I can just take the moderator's prerogative to start off with a question inspired, Dr. Ren, by your remarks. You made the point that that at one point that you know, how can other countries, United States and the rest of the world, collaborate with China on climate and environmental and ecological issues if sort of the underpinnings are under question in terms of sort of the fidelity to these ideals. And so I'm curious, as we turn this panel to a conversation about China and the world, what some of the speakers' thoughts are about that. And Dr. Ren, I don't know, maybe if you have a starting point, or I see Dr. Shapiro, you coming off of mute, so maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I actually responded to a question about this in the chat to underline this. The question is going to be, how do they implement this? One thing I want to say in response to what Ran and Yongmou said is, I don't think Yifei and I are trying to criticize China. We want China to succeed in these issues. And listening to this music reminds us we've got so much at stake, right? So China will succeed more and better if they listen to the people, if they're not afraid, if the policymakers are not afraid of the people, and if they don't get it all wrapped up in these other agendas. So even though I think Ran is right, the Politburo didn't suddenly wake up and hug a tree. They may have other motivations. They may not be deep ecologists, but they're pragmatists, right? And this gets to Steve Wolfson's question in the Q&A. They really want these double wins because the Chinese people are tired of getting lung cancer. And so if they don't deal with those sorts of issues, and the water pollution and the food contamination and the soil contamination and all of that, then their legitimacy as a governance entity is going to be at stake. They have to deal with the ground level pollution and at the same time deal with the climate, which is a security threat as well. I mean, Yifei lives in Shanghai. The water is rising outside of Shanghai. They're building a Rotterdam type of seawall, right? Or maybe they already have one, I don't know. And they're worried about the glaciers, and they're putting blankets on the glaciers to make them melt less quickly, I'm sorry. So, the Chinese government gets this. And I always tell my students, you can't generalize about what the government thinks or what the government's motivation is, whether it's China or any other country in the world. But to recognize our shared goals. And I think it's so important that the US and China share information about this, that it doesn't get all involved with trade disputes, this issue, we should be able to bracket off from all of the other issues that we're arguing about and work together on this. So that's what I want to say. That's my concluding remark.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I know we're short on time. So just as we're thinking about wrapping up and framing out the rest of the concluding remarks, I wonder if, inspired, Dr. Shapiro, by your concluding remarks, if the other speakers and respondents might just think, in the spirit of certainly why and how the California China Climate Institute was created is to facilitate and promote cooperation and understanding between China and the US. And I think as we've heard here, you know, there are challenges to achieving environmental objectives, certainly through China's more authoritarian approach, but there are also challenges with the US more democratic approach. And so would love to hear from all of the speakers and respondents some final wisdom to share both with China and the US on how to combat climate change, both individually and collectively.
If I could respond to that quickly, I think, you know, one of the things that was extremely helpful and in fact was robustly developing under the Obama administration was science collaboration, was that Chinese and American scholars coming together to work on some of the most pressing issues. The Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, for example, was at the forefront of cutting edge research in China about building energy efficiency, in particular in energy issues in general. And there are many other scholars who previously worked on, American scholars who previously worked on China-related issues were fearful under the Trump years to have any explicit or even implicit connections with China for fear of any consequences that might, any unpleasant consequences that might come their way. And I think the past 4 years under the Trump administration, we've seen a radical decline of effective scientific collaboration by top researchers in our two countries to actually work on some of those issues. That collaboration is so important because, you know, without it, China may be able to have some initial findings based on its data, but it's not getting shared the way it should. It's not, the expertise is not cross-fertilizing the way it should, and that's just not benefiting anyone. So perhaps, you know, a very concrete note for the Biden administration, especially because of the priority that the administration has given to climate change and climate partnerships with China and certainly with other countries as well, is to perhaps restore that kind of open scientific exchange. So once again, going back to Dr. Jerry Brown's earlier point about open but disciplined inquiries, and that's precisely what we need moving forward in the Anthropocene.
Wonderful, open and disciplined inquiry. I love it. And then Doctors Ron and Liu Yongmou, would you both maybe just take a minute to 30 seconds to a minute and share your thoughts on the question or concluding remarks?
Yeah, just a quick response to like how to make us more hopeful. I think I use Judith's words. It depends on the people. So maybe we just can't wait for the political elites to do a huge change, but everyday people, like we can change a little bit. So in an interview with the U.S. embassy in Beijing, and they told me among so many difficulties in U.S.-China relations, environmental and climate actually one of the best. So for most environmentalists, we are pessimistic, but still among so many hard work in U.S.-China, I think environment and climate change should be one of the areas like we have better hope. I would just show a picture by my daughter, because my daughter actually born in U.S. and she draw this after she saw me read this book. So I think it's after the next generation must be also the hope.
Beautiful.
Okay, I just one sentence. I think, you know, after the COVID-19, you know, many ideas about, you know, environmental issues, many ideas about, you know, science, about the knowledge are changed, I think. So it's a very good time, and it's right now we need to reconsider our ideology and reconsider the relationship between the, you know, the USA and China. I think we have a lot of opportunity to cooperate, you know, to deal with the environmental issues. We need action now. yeah, that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our participants, especially to our panelists. Thank you, Carl and Governor Brown, for the impetus of this event. Thank you, Richard, for the beautiful music, reminding us to connect all of our conversation to the urgency of the issue. And thank you again, Drs. Li and Shapiro, for writing this book and giving us the occasion to get together and discuss. It's been really wonderful having this conversation with you all. And for those that are interested in sharing this conversation, will be available on our website. So thank you again. And please also check out our upcoming events that the Institute will be hosting over the next month. We're very busy and have lots to share with you. So thank you all. Have a good night.